Picture this. It is Tuesday night, just 90 minutes before a deadline that could have reshaped the entire Middle East. American long-range strategic bombers and the heaviest strike aircraft in the United States arsenal are already airborne and hours into their flight. Their assigned targets include power generation facilities, transportation bridges, and critical civilian infrastructure. The pilots have their orders and their final checklists are complete. Then the phone rings. Within hours, those massive aircraft bank left. They turn around in the cold night air. They head home. There are no strikes. There are no explosions. There is no civilization dying in fire and smoke. What just happened? And more importantly, what does this mean for the next 2 weeks, for the global economy, and for a world that came terrifyingly close to the edge of something it might never have walked back from? We break down the most critical global events in real time. No fluff, no spin, just analysis. What is unfolding right now is one of the most consequential 48-hour periods in recent geopolitical history, and we are just getting started. Let us set the full stage here because context is everything. This conflict, and yes, we must call it a full-scale conflict, began on February 28, 2026. That is when the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran under what has been designated as a major joint operation. The target list included military compounds, nuclear research facilities, and command and control infrastructure. That is not a skirmish. That is not a limited airstrike. That was the opening act of a sustained military campaign, and Iran's response was immediate, dramatic, and strategically devastating. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. If you do not fully grasp what that means for the world, let me place the numbers directly in front of you right now. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest navigable point. Through that narrow passage flows roughly 20 million barrels of oil every single day. That is approximately 1/5 of all global seaborne oil trade. It is the funnel through which the Gulf's vast energy reserves enter the global economy, and Iran shut it down. They did not just cut off crude oil shipments. They triggered what the International Energy Agency has officially called, in their own precise wording, the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. That is not an exaggeration or hyperbole. That is the assessment of the institution whose core function is to monitor global energy markets. They are stating this is unprecedented, bigger than the crisis of 1973, bigger than the disruptions of 1979, bigger than anything we have witnessed in the modern history of energy markets. Brent crude surged past $100 per barrel for the first time in 4 years. It peaked at $126 per barrel. Analysts were running models showing prices could hit $200 a barrel if the closure extended through the second quarter of the year. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas published research projecting that a single quarter-long Hormuz closure would lower global real gross domestic product growth by nearly 3 percentage points on an annualized basis. The United Nations Trade and Development Agency warned of cascading impacts on food prices, fertilizer supply, and aviation logistics. Gulf states began facing what economists labeled a grocery supply emergency, with 70% of their food imports disrupted by mid-March. And this was not just an oil problem. This was an everything problem. According to the World Economic Forum, beyond crude oil, the strait carries roughly 1/3 of global seaborne methanol trade, nearly half of all global sulfur exports, significant volumes of aluminum, helium, fertilizers, and the petroleum coke that feeds electric vehicle battery manufacturing. The Philippines implemented a temporary 4-day working week to manage fuel costs. Airlines rerouted flights around the Middle Eastern airspace, adding hours to journeys and burning millions more gallons of fuel. Major shipping companies had already suspended Middle East routes entirely. The Stimson Center described the Strait of Hormuz not as a tactical lever, but as, and this is their phrasing, a transmission belt between regional war and the global economy. That is the lens through which you have to understand everything that happened on that Tuesday night. Now, before we go deeper into the mechanics of this arrangement, let us talk about the 48 hours that led to the ceasefire. Because this was not a clean diplomatic resolution. It was chaotic, last minute, and full of contradictions that are still playing out right now as we speak. In the days before the deadline, the pressure was extraordinary. The President of the United States had been issuing increasingly extreme warnings via social media. On Easter Sunday, April 5th, he posted, and I will read this because the tone matters. Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day all wrapped up in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it. Open the strait, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. That is a sitting president of the United States writing those words on social media. The escalation was real, and the deadline was absolute. But inside the White House, there was a split. On one side, the Israeli Prime Minister, along with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, pushed to reject any deal unless Iran made major upfront concessions. On the other side, the Vice President and senior special envoys advised taking a deal if one was reachable. And then Pakistan stepped in. This is the detail that tends to get glossed over in the broader narrative, and it should not be ignored. The Pakistani Prime Minister and the Army Chief personally reached out to the American President. They proposed a framework, a 2-week ceasefire, during which Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz and both sides would enter formal negotiations. The American president confirmed in his announcement, and I am quoting him directly here, that he agreed to suspend strikes on Iran based on conversations with the Pakistani leadership, who requested he hold off on the destructive force being sent that night. Pakistan is not the most obvious mediator in a conflict between the United States and Iran, but they had both the motivation and the access. Pakistan relies heavily on Gulf oil imports. Their economy had been hammered by the Hormuz closure, and critically, they had credibility with both parties. This is geopolitical improvisation in its rawest form. Messy, human, real, and it worked. Let us get into the precise mechanics of what was agreed, because this is where it becomes genuinely fascinating and genuinely complicated. On the American side, the president announced a 2-week suspension of strikes on Iran. In his social media post, he described it as a double-sided ceasefire. He stated the United States had met and exceeded all military objectives. He acknowledged receiving a 10-point proposal from Iran and called it, and again, quoting him, a workable basis on which to negotiate. He was careful not to say he was accepting the 10-point plan, merely that it was a foundation for talks. On the Iranian side, the foreign minister confirmed the deal in a statement issued on behalf of Iran's Supreme National Security Council. He confirmed that if attacks on Iran were halted, Iranian armed forces would cease their defensive operations. He confirmed that safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz would be possible during the 2-week period, but with a critical caveat. He specified it would be via coordination with Iranian armed forces and with due consideration of technical limitations. What are those technical limitations? Sea mines. During the conflict, Iranian forces laid mines across sections of the strait. They cannot all be located and removed quickly, so Iran is essentially saying ships can pass, but only through corridors we designate and coordinate. Given that over 100 ships transited the strait daily before the war, and the total for the entire past month was barely 100 ships combined, you can already see the massive bottleneck forming. And then the ceasefire promptly showed its first fractures. Within minutes of the announcement, missiles were launched from Iran toward Israel. One was intercepted on the outskirts of a major metropolitan area. Iranian naval forces also reportedly halted oil tanker traffic through the strait again, just hours after the first tankers had been allowed through, citing Israel's continued strikes in Lebanon. Persian Gulf states reported new Iranian attacks on oil sites. Iran's parliament speaker accused the United States of violating 3 points of the agreement, specifically the ceasefire in Lebanon, a drone entering Iranian airspace, and the denial of Iran's right to nuclear enrichment. Here is where it gets interesting, and this is the part that requires you to think carefully about how ceasefires actually function in the real world. The disconnect between what Iran's leadership agreed to and what Iran's military forces were actually doing is not necessarily bad faith at the very top. it reflects something much more structurally significant. The wave of targeted actions throughout this conflict, focusing on commanders and naval officers, has severely degraded Iran's chain of command. The Iranian military is, in some meaningful sense, operating in compartmentalized cells that are not always receiving or processing orders from the leadership with speed or clarity. We saw this during previous conflicts last year. Ceasefires get announced. Lower-level units with access to launch systems keep firing anyway. It does not mean the agreement is dead. It means the implementation will be messy and contested. This is exactly why the vice president characterized the situation as a fragile truce. He told reporters the ceasefire would not hold if the strait remained closed, while simultaneously acknowledging that he was already seeing signs of increased traffic. He said plainly, "If we don't see the strait reopening, the president is not going to abide by our terms." That is a very specific ultimatum tied to a very specific deliverable, and as of right now, the situation remains ambiguous. There is also the Lebanon problem, and this is the most politically explosive piece of the entire puzzle. Israel and Iran have been fighting a separate but connected war. Israel has invaded southern Lebanon and has been conducting sustained airstrikes targeting Iranian proxy forces. Pakistan's prime minister publicly stated the ceasefire covered Lebanon too. Iranian negotiators appear to have understood Lebanon to be included, but the White House stated clearly, Lebanon is not part of this agreement. The Israeli government confirmed it would comply with the ceasefire regarding Iran, but continue striking Lebanon. So, you have a situation where the mediator says one thing, one party believes one thing, and the other party's position is something else entirely. European leaders, including Germany, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, Denmark, Spain, the Netherlands, and Canada, issued a joint statement calling on all sides to implement the ceasefire, including in Lebanon. The European Union leadership called it a potential solution to what was warned could become a severe global energy crisis. But that joint statement has no enforcement mechanism. It is a plea, not a guarantee. And we need to talk about the 10-point proposal because this document is the key to understanding where the next 2 weeks go. Iran's 10-point proposal, as laid out through Iranian state media, is extraordinarily ambitious. Point 1. Iran wants guarantees it will not be attacked again. Point 2. A permanent end to the war. Not just a ceasefire, a permanent end. Point 3. An end to Israeli strikes on Lebanon. Point 4. Lifting of all sanctions on Iran. Point 5. An end to all regional fighting against Iranian allies. Point 6. In return, Iran would open the Strait of Hormuz. Point 7. Iran would impose a Hormuz transit fee of $2 million per ship. Point 8. Oman would share in those fees. Point 9. Iran would provide rules of safe passage through Hormuz. Point 10. Hormuz fees would be used for reconstruction, not reparations. Now, point 7 is the one that will generate the most friction in negotiations. $2 million per ship sounds almost modest when you are talking about very large crude carriers worth hundreds of millions, but the precedent it sets is extraordinary. If Iran charges a fee to traverse an international strait, what stops another nation from charging ships through the Danish Straits? What stops a country from levying fees in the Strait of Gibraltar? This would be reversing literally 2 centuries of maritime freedom of navigation norms. The world moved away from this model for a reason, and Iran knows they are unlikely to get it. The strategic value of point 7 is as a bargaining chip, something they will sacrifice in exchange for concessions they actually want more. The White House's official position is that they have accepted none of the 10 points. The press secretary said the original 10-point plan was, quoting here, literally thrown in the garbage by the president and his negotiating team. So, there is already a fundamental dispute between what Iran says was agreed and what Washington acknowledges. This mirrors every major ceasefire in history. Both sides frame the moment as their victory. Iranian state media broadcasts internally that the bombers turned around because Iran held firm. American media reports that the military campaign created the leverage for diplomatic success. Both narratives are politically necessary. Neither is fully accurate. Here is where it gets interesting at the negotiating table. Talks are expected to begin in Islamabad on Friday, April 10th. The vice president is expected to lead the American delegation. Iran's delegation will reportedly be led by the foreign minister and the parliament speaker. Pakistan hosts, and the two most contentious issues on the table are also the two issues where the gap between the parties is widest. First, Iran's nuclear enrichment program. The American president hardened his position late Wednesday, saying there will be no uranium enrichment, full stop. But Iran's 10-point proposal reportedly includes acceptance of enrichment as a baseline requirement. Analysts at King's College London have noted that the enrichment question is exactly what caused the previous round of negotiations to collapse in February. Iran views enrichment as a sovereign right. The United States views enrichment continuation as an existential proliferation risk. There is no obvious middle ground here. Second, sanctions. Iran wants all sanctions lifted. That is a non-starter in the current political environment without extraordinary concessions in return. The administration has signaled it might discuss tariff and sanctions relief, but only within a framework of verifiable Iranian compliance on nuclear and military limits. Iran will want those limits minimized. The United States will want them maximized and verified. This is a negotiation that could take months, not days. This brings us to the journalist release, because it is a piece of the story that deserves more attention than it is currently getting. An American journalist had been kidnapped a week prior in Baghdad, Iraq by a militia with known ties to Iran. She was abducted by a group operating inside Iraq, and critically, she was released before the ceasefire announcement was made. According to multiple reports and confirmed by the State Department, her release was the result of intensive behind-the-scenes work by the Iraqi government operating separately from the main negotiations. This matters because it tells us something about the Iraqi government's capacity and motivation to act as an independent diplomatic player, not just a proxy battlefield. Iraq does not want this war. They are absorbing collateral damage daily, and when they had the ability to move quietly and resolve one piece of this crisis, they did it. Now, let us zoom out, because to understand why Iran is negotiating the way it is negotiating, you have to understand a history that goes much, much further back than February 28th. The Strait of Hormuz has been at the center of Iranian strategic thinking for decades. This is not new. Iran's ability to threaten the strait has historically been both its greatest leverage point and its greatest vulnerability. It is leverage because it can cause enormous pain globally, almost immediately. It is a vulnerability because actually closing the strait also devastates Iran's own oil revenues. Iran needs to export oil. Every day the strait is closed is also a day Iran is hemorrhaging income. The pattern of escalation and de-escalation in the strait goes back to the tanker war of the 1980s, when the United States military had to escort oil tankers through Gulf waters. The current situation has echoes of that period, but the scale is different. The global interdependence is different, and the military capabilities on all sides, including drone warfare, precision strikes, and the ability to mine and demine waterways, are categorically different from anything seen in that era. What makes this ceasefire structurally fragile is precisely what makes it significant. For the first time, Iran's Supreme National Security Council has formally acknowledged the ceasefire and confirmed a willingness to negotiate based on an American-originated proposal framework. Iran's supreme leader has personally approved the deal. That is not nothing. In the internal politics of the Iranian regime, that level of explicit top-level endorsement matters. Even if the military chain of command is fractured, even if lower-level units keep firing, the political legitimacy of this ceasefire at the highest level of Iranian authority is real. And the question that matters most right now, the question that every energy market analyst, every diplomat, every government in Asia and Europe is watching, is whether the strait can functionally reopen in a way that allows shipping to resume. The technical picture is complicated. Beyond the mines, there is the matter of insurance. Major shipping companies have been operating under war risk insurance provisions that essentially make Hormuz transits commercially prohibitive. Those provisions do not disappear because a ceasefire was announced on Tuesday night. They require documented stability, consistent safe passage, and confidence that naval forces will not revert to their previous behavior. According to financial analysts, that process of restoring commercial shipping confidence could take weeks, even under the best-case scenario. The backlog is extraordinary. Before the conflict, over 100 ships were transiting the strait daily. During the past month of conflict, the total count was barely that across the entire period. That is roughly 3 ships per day instead of over 100. You have tankers queued in the Gulf of Oman. You have crude oil sitting in storage that producers need to move. And now you are going to route it all through lanes constrained by mine clearance requirements. The congestion is going to be significant even in the best case. And here is the bigger picture reality that every government watching this ceasefire needs to sit with. This is not a peace deal. This is not even close to a peace deal. As one regional analyst put it, all sides have basically agreed to disagree and kick their core disagreements into the long grass. The enrichment question, the sanctions question, the regional proxy forces question, the normalization of sovereignty over maritime traffic. None of these issues have been resolved. None of them will be resolved in 2 weeks. They may not be resolvable in 2 years. What this ceasefire is a pause. A critically important pause. A pause that prevents what could have been an irreversible military escalation tonight. A pause that gives the global economy a window to breathe. A pause that gives diplomats a table to sit at. The G7 nations plus European Union leadership calling it a potential solution to a severe global energy crisis are right, but only if the pause becomes something more durable, and that is not guaranteed. So, what do we watch for in the coming days? Watch the strait. Not just whether ships are moving, watch what kinds of ships, under what conditions, and under whose coordination. If Iran is demanding armed forces coordination for every vessel, that is not freedom of navigation. That is sovereignty over international waters. The White House has already said that Iran charging tolls would be considered a limitation violating the terms of the arrangement. These two positions are not yet reconciled. Watch Lebanon. Israel has been explicit. The ceasefire does not cover Lebanon. Iran and Pakistan believe it does. If Israeli strikes in Lebanon continue at their current intensity, Iran's military factions will use that as justification to resume attacks, possibly regardless of what their political leadership in Tehran has agreed to. That Lebanon variable could unravel this arrangement faster than any other single factor. Watch Islamabad. The talks beginning Friday, April 10th, will be the first real test of whether there is a genuine negotiating path here. The vice president leading the delegation signals this is a priority at the highest level of the executive branch. But the Iranian delegation's instructions, the gaps between the proposals, and the nuclear red line are all enormous obstacles that have not moved. And watch the markets. Oil below $100 is the market's verdict on cautious optimism. If Hormuz traffic resumes meaningfully, prices fall further. If it stalls, if a new attack occurs, if Lebanon triggers a collapse of the framework, prices spike back toward that $126 peak very fast. The economic modeling is clear on the consequences of an extended closure. The world economy cannot absorb a second quarter closure of the Hormuz Strait without entering what analysts are already calling a potential stagflationary shock. The bottom line is this: Tuesday night's ceasefire is real. The planes turned around. The bombs did not fall. The strait is for now nominally open to coordinated passage. An American journalist is free. And 2 of the most consequential adversaries in the global energy system are sitting down at a table in Islamabad in less than 48 hours to try to figure out if there is a world in which this war permanently ends. That is not nothing. That is actually remarkable given where we were 72 hours ago when the president was posting about civilizations dying and students were forming human shields around power plants. But let us be clear-eyed. This is fragile. The vice president used that exact word, fragile, and fragile things break.